Airborne. Once it meant an elite cadre of brave men floating to earth under a few square yards of silk. Men willing to fight the enemy in his own backyard, with only the weapons and equipment they could carry on their own backs. But Airborne has come to mean much more than that. Today, it represents a combined arms inter-service team of men and women capable of moving and supporting entire division-sized formations of fully equipped fighting men virtually anywhere in the world at a few hours' notice. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines. All branches of our armed forces are part of this air mobile team. As weapons, equipment, and tactics develop further, the distinction between our once separate and competing services will continue to blur. More and more, everything is becoming airborne. The armies of the future won't look like those of the past. Neither will they fight like them. High tech has become the watchword of the day. On tomorrow's battlefields, computer skills will almost certainly be more important to the cause of victory than marksmanship. But the bravery of the individual soldier is and always will be the most important component in any fighting force. Nowhere can we see this fact more clearly demonstrated than by tracing the development of one of the most daring and intrepid units in our entire armed forces, the United States Airborne.
Prepare to land. Prepare to land. Land.
In less than 3 years of combat in Europe during World War II, the American Airborne had become a legend. Tens of thousands of men had shouted Geronimo and descended from the skies to go into battle in Sicily and Salerno, Normandy and Holland, and the Rhine. Those battlefields were witness to the birth of the Airborne as a combat force. But it was in the Pacific theater of World War II and on the battlefields of Korea that the Airborne came of age and proved itself as a powerful new weapon and tactic in America's arsenal. The war in Europe had quickly become a conventional land war. Armies advanced and retreated over miles and miles of solid ground, trying to attain conventional military and political objectives. But war in Asia and the Pacific was hardly ever conventional. It didn't end up that way in Korea or Vietnam. But it didn't start out that way in World War II. Our airborne forces were designed to take advantage of the possibilities presented by these unconventional circumstances. Specialized training began in 1942 under the watchful eye of Secretary of War Henry Stimson. He saw the idea of airborne foot soldiers change from a brave dream into a deadly reality. Here he reviews the 82nd Airborne Division at its base in North Carolina, on the eve of its deployment to Europe. It's about to participate in full-scale exercises to show what airborne can do. The amazing success of the Germans in airborne operations like Crete had awakened belated American interest in vertical envelopment. That means landing a combat force behind enemy lines to seize key positions, and then having them hold those positions until regular forces can drive a wedge through the enemy to link up with them, like playing a lethal game of leapfrog. Reliable C-47s like these were to serve as the main airborne transport plane throughout World War II. There was nothing new about the idea of an airborne army. American air power visionary Billy Mitchell had conceived the idea in World War I. He had actually received approval for an airborne operation to break the great stalemate on the Western Front, but the war ended before it could be launched. Here, shock troops of the 82nd drop on simulated strong points and seize landing sites for the more heavily equipped glider-borne forces that were to follow. On other airfields, specially modified C-47 Skytrains hitched on to troop carrier gliders that were loaded and ready. Once hooked together, the transport towed the glider into position for takeoff. Some Skytrains hauled double loads. Taxiing at full throttle, the tow planes had to remain on the ground until the 1.5-ton gliders were in the air. Once over the drop zone, glider pilots cut their planes loose and headed for their landing zones. Banking sharply away, they dove for the ground. The quickest possible landing kept the unarmed gliders from becoming easy game for enemy fighters and anti-aircraft guns. Once on the ground, the glider army joined with the paratroopers in setting up a defensive perimeter that would hold until regular forces broke through to relieve them. This, in theory, was the pattern of the textbook World War II airborne operation, but often in warfare things can't go by the book. Improvisation and adaptation to special circumstances are required to achieve specific goals. Such was the case in the operation to retake Corregidor, the Rock, in February 1945, where there was simply no room to employ gliders at all. Corregidor's strategic location in Manila Bay made its reconquest crucial to the entire operation to retake the Philippines. It was also one of the most spectacular and least known airborne operations in all of World War II. The rocky terrain of the small island presented one of the most difficult jump fields imaginable. There were only 2 possible drop zones, the old parade ground and the golf course. Neither was much bigger than a postage stamp. The wind across them gusted up to 20 miles per hour. And waiting for our men once they got down were some 6,000 fanatical Japanese defenders, dug deeply into the hundreds of caves and tunnels that honeycombed the island. The fleet of C-47 swept in low over the target. The troops hooked themselves to the wire that pulled their parachutes' ripcords and prepared to jump. Finally, the moment arrived and they leapt out of their planes, barely a few hundred feet above the target. There was little initial enemy resistance to the landings, but that didn't mean our forces found it easy. Rough landings, always a hazard in parachute drops, were even more of a problem on the extremely rocky landscape of Corregidor. There were almost as many men wounded in rough landings as there were in enemy action that first day. But despite this problem, our forces quickly gathered themselves and went into action, even as the jumps went on. The drop zones were too small for everyone to jump at once, so each transport had to make several passes before all its men were out. It took almost an hour and a half to get everybody down. This initial consolidation phase is always the most dangerous part of an airborne operation. The first troops down have to keep from being overwhelmed until they have marshaled enough forces for a successful attack. Surprise is crucial. Without it, the early waves of paratroopers would be sitting ducks. We lost almost a quarter of our men in rough landings and firefights, but we took the enemy by surprise. They recovered quickly, however, and had to be rooted out of every bunker and tunnel, man by man. It took 12 bloody days. Finally, the bulk of the Japanese survivors killed themselves by blowing up Malinta Tunnel, where they had gathered for a last abortive banzai charge. Ironically, it was this very tunnel that had served as MacArthur's own headquarters while he was directing the defense of Corregidor 3 years before. This newsreel footage shows an amphibious assault by regular troops that were brought ashore soon after the airborne landings. As soon as our combined forces finished defeating the enemy, mopping up operations began. Once they were complete, the Rock was ours once more. There were numerous other airborne operations in World War II, operations such as Normandy, Arnhem, and the Rhine crossing. But despite their success, many were still skeptical of the entire airborne concept of warfare. So most of our airborne units were deactivated in the post-war years. The 13th, the 17th, even the 101st. The last American use of gliders in combat was in northern Luzon in 1945. The glider infantry was eventually disbanded. The glider sold as surplus. The legend almost died back then. Only 2 airborne units survived, the budget cuts and the opposition of conservative generals who thought they were just trick outfits. The 82nd went back to the United States. The 11th spent 4 years on occupation duty in Japan. But the 11th, too, had been back in the States for almost a year on June 25th, 1950. Korea, June 1950. It was here in this crucible of fire and ice that our airborne forces were to make a dramatic comeback from near extinction. 3 days after the North Koreans struck across the 38th parallel, the South's capital of Seoul fell into their hands. At President Truman's urging, the United Nations took responsibility for South Korea's defense. Within a few days of the initial attack, United Nations forces, made up mainly of units from the United States military, were committed to the battle. These forces were placed under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. They fought valiantly, but despite their efforts, they couldn't stem the tide. They were forced to fall back toward the south. By mid-August, United Nations forces were pushed back into a small perimeter around the port city of Pusan at the southeastern tip of the Korean peninsula. Reinforcements were rushed in. Part of that reinforcement was the 187th Airborne Regimental Combat Team. They would make the only combat jumps in Korea. But more importantly, they proved that airborne troops were capable of undertaking all types of operations, even those normally reserved for regular Army units. This paved the way for the acceptance of airborne troops as an integral part of our armed forces in the years to come. The military situation in Korea was desperate. Something had to be done, or the United Nations forces would be pushed into the sea. With his usual flair for the dramatic, MacArthur came up with a plan that would not only save our remaining forces, but also defeat the North Korean invasion of the South at a single stroke. On September 15th, 1950, MacArthur made a daring amphibious landing at Incheon, halfway up Korea's west coast, well behind the main body of North Korean forces. The 187th was airlifted into nearby Kinpo airfield to support the assault. Their mission was to clear the Kinpo Peninsula. They killed or captured almost 3,000 North Korean soldiers during the battle. After they were done, the peninsula was secure. The landing at Incheon was a brilliant success. With their supply lines cut, the North Koreans were forced into full retreat. On September 25th, Seoul was recaptured. On October 7th, the UN General Assembly authorized MacArthur to cross the 38th parallel into North Korea. The offensive was on. By mid-October, it approached Pyongyang, the North Korean capital. It wasn't long before U.S. airborne troops were to see action again. The 187th was dropped behind enemy lines north of Pyongyang. Their mission was to seal off enemy escape routes from the capital. This was the first combat jump in Korea, and MacArthur himself watched it from his personal plane. More supplies, including heavy equipment, were airdropped in. By the end of the day, they had secured their positions. Then, for 4 days and nights, the North Koreans sent massive attacks against them. But despite the appalling conditions, they held on until our ground forces could finally move up. MacArthur's offensive was rolling fast. By mid-November, it neared the Yalu River, the border with Red China. The offensive kept moving ever closer to the Yalu. MacArthur assured President Truman that there was very little chance that China would enter the war. He was wrong. On November 25th, hundreds of thousands of Chinese troops poured across the Yalu into Korea. Caught totally off guard, United Nations troops were forced to withdraw. Suddenly, the Korean War was a whole new ballgame. It was during the awful retreat from the frozen wastes of North Korea that the line traditionally separating our airborne forces from the other branches of the service began to blur. The personal experiences of a typical airborne soldier that you are about to hear were not unique. They could have been experienced by men in any branch of the service, but they show that airborne soldiers do much more than just jump out of airplanes. They also must fight on the ground, just like any other soldier.
I'd tell you my name, rank, and serial number, but I really don't think it matters. I was just another guy with a rifle. We all were. Some people call Korea the Forgotten War. Now let me tell you, brother, no one who was there will ever forget it. Not for one day. Not for 1 minute. It's not the place I'm talking about so much. It's the people that I'll never forget. Like the pilots of the planes that covered us when we were fighting our way out from the Chosin Reservoir. Sometimes they'd come in so low, I swear to God I could see their faces. Those wonderful, crazy bastards. If it hadn't been for them, I might not be here today. A lot of us wouldn't. I remember other faces, too. Good faces. Young faces. Full of joy, anger, fear, pain. Everything that the craziness of war can squeeze out of someone. Like the face of the wounded GI I found. He was being evacuated with a bunch of other wounded when the Chinese ambushed his column. They went through every truck and shot our wounded one by one. But for some reason, they missed this guy. He was the only one in the whole column who survived. He was grateful and happy to see us. But there was something else in his face, too. A look that said, "Why me? Out of all of them, why was I the only one who made it?" Later on, things kind of stabilized along the 38th parallel and truce talks began. But that didn't end the fighting, or the dying. They attacked us, we attacked them. We'd push them off a hill and they'd push us right back off again. Over and over, the same hills, the same strong points. Like a big meat grinder that kept going 24 hours a day. It got so crazy sometimes we didn't know what the hell was going on. Thank God for the choppers. If you needed help, they could get it to you. If you were wounded, they could get you out, even if you were cut off and surrounded. I just wish they'd had more of them. Sometimes during the winter it got so cold we had to sleep during the day to keep from freezing to death. Another time they told us we had to conserve ammunition and artillery shells. Something about there being a shortage of steel because of a strike back home. A strike back home. While we were there dying. We could hardly believe that one. But I guess the thing I'll remember most is the face of a buddy of mine. We were hunkered down one night and suddenly they opened up on us with everything they had. I remember looking back and catching a glimpse of him in his foxhole. And suddenly, there was a flash. He wasn't there anymore. Just completely gone. In that one instant, he had simply ceased to exist. None of us will ever be the same again.
The Korean War taught many lessons, both military and political, but not all of them were learned. One that was, though, was the versatility of the helicopter. See, in Korea, it had been used mainly for observation and evacuation of casualties. But some people thought it had an even greater potential. One of them was General James Gavin, former commander of the 82nd Airborne. In 1954, when Gavin was chief of plans and operations for the Army, he wrote an article for Harper's Magazine. The title was Cavalry, and I don't mean horses, and it urged the development of helicopter-borne assault forces. Gavin's article was published in April of 1954. In May, Ho Chi Minh's forces captured Dien Bien Phu and pushed the French out of what came to be known as Vietnam. In an effort to draw the elusive Vietnamese forces into a decisive battle, the French had parachuted an entire division of their finest airborne troops deep into enemy territory. But unlike traditional airborne operations, there was to be no link-up with advancing ground forces. The soldiers of Dien Bien Phu were to stand on their own and fight it out. It was a disastrous mistake. After a long and bloody siege, the French garrison was utterly destroyed. Back in the United States, the recommendations of Gavin and other Army planners soon became reality. The master unit was the Air Mobile Division. It included helicopters, assault troops, maintenance, supply, everything a unit needed to function independently, combined into one self-contained force under one unified command. Quite a difference from the fragmented responsibility of World War II and Korea. Air Mobile forces were designed to get in fast, deep behind enemy lines, surprise the enemy, and strike hard. Then the objective was to link up with oncoming ground troops or get out as soon as possible to fly on to other battles. Their first use in combat was not far off. The situation in Vietnam was beginning to escalate. Soon, American troops were sent in, and they kept on coming. Among them was a brand new unit, the U.S. Army's 1st Air Cavalry. It wasn't long before the 1st Air Cav was tested in combat. They were sent on a search-and-destroy mission, a hit-and-run type of operation designed to exploit the fast, hard-hitting nature of the new air mobile units to the fullest. The time was October 1965. The place was the Nha Trang Valley in South Vietnam. The Special Forces camp there was under attack by North Vietnamese forces. The 1st Air Cavalry was ordered in to attack the attackers. In a lightning campaign, they forced the NVA to break off the attack and pursued them back to their base camps in the mountains. Then they swept in with their Hueys and chased the enemy out of their strongholds. By November 18th, the Battle of the Nha Trang Valley was over. In the 35-day operation, the 1st Air Cav had proven what Air Mobile could do, and Nha Trang became a prototype for the employment of the new air mobile concept of warfare. There was only one combat jump in Vietnam. The 173rd Airborne parachuted into an area near the Cambodian border as part of an operation called Junction City. But Vietnam wasn't a paratroopers' war. More and more, the classic parachute jump was becoming a thing of the past. The emphasis was now on air mobile, and that's where it stayed. As this captured North Vietnamese footage shows, the enemy was highly adept at moving swiftly through the deepest jungles, hitting hard, and then slipping away again when faced with superior firepower. That was exactly the advantage the new air mobile tactics sought to neutralize. Though our casualties were heavy, the new tactics were highly successful. There were to be no Dien Bien Phus inflicted on American air mobile forces in Vietnam. Thanks to the new methods, the hunter had become the hunted. Today's airborne soldiers fly into battle in huge, sleek aircraft. The weapons they carry are highly sophisticated. But underneath, they have the same spirit as the men who landed on Sicily and Normandy, Holland and Corregidor. They're still a very special breed, still devils in baggy pants and spit-shine jump boots, ready, willing, and able to jump out of perfectly good aircraft. Nowhere is that spirit or the modern concept of air mobility more in evidence than in the invasion of Grenada in 1983. After a bloody left-wing military coup, American policymakers, citing United States concerns about the hundreds of American medical students on the island, decided to take military action to ensure their safety. 5:36 a.m. The assault began when 400 Marines and troop helicopters captured Pearls Airport, the island's only operational airstrip. 36 minutes later, hundreds of Rangers, the U.S. Army's elite special forces, parachuted onto the uncompleted runway at Point Salinas Airport on Grenada's southwestern tip. 7:15 a.m. The airstrip was secured, and choppers arrived with reinforcements. Among them was a contingent of some 400 troops gathered from 6 of Grenada's Caribbean neighbors. Our forces made progress, but troops loyal to the new regime and their Cuban allies refused to give up without a fight. While more troops and supplies were dropped on one part of the island, a U.S. Navy helicopter undertook a hazardous mission to rescue the crew of a downed U.S. Army Black Hawk helicopter. Meanwhile, Marines and Rangers in several choppers landed at one of Grenada's 2 medical campuses and took the students to safety. These dramatic videos were shot from their own back porch by American expatriates who were caught up in the battle. The size and complexity of the Grenada operation took the air mobile tactics of Vietnam one giant step further.
The markings are all blanked out with what looks like brown paint. That's the main force. It's going to put down.
No longer were air mobile units confined to formations within a single service. Now they encompassed elements from virtually every branch of our armed forces. The invasion of Grenada turned out to be a proving ground for the modern post-Vietnam methods of air mobile warfare. In all, the operation involved some 6,000 airborne troops and took 3 days. It was not without problems. Resistance was stiffer and losses heavier than expected. In addition, coordination between the different elements of the invasion force were sometimes less than smooth, and the political issues surrounding our intervention are still being debated. But there were no American civilian casualties, and the military lessons learned there were put into practice the next time U.S. air mobile forces were used in combat. In Panama, May 1989, Panamanian strongman Manuel Noriega blatantly stole an election through the use of force and intimidation. Noriega's so-called dignity battalions of armed thugs took to the streets and attacked the opposition. Soon the country was in a virtual state of siege. It was feared that Noriega's next target might be the 30,000 American civilians living in Panama to operate the canal. The United States reacted by airlifting in reinforcements to the 12,700 troops already permanently stationed in Panama to protect the canal. The actual assault, dubbed Operation Just Cause, began with a night parachute drop by more than 3,000 men. one of the most hazardous operations in all of warfare, this night drop was the largest combat drop of any kind since World War II. Minutes later, they were joined by some 4,000 other troops. The initial 7,000-man force was taken from 6 widely scattered U.S. military bases. In an impressive feat of logistic planning, the various task forces arrived over Panama virtually simultaneously. Once on the ground, U.S. forces hit Noriega's strongholds hard. Resistance was stiff, but Noriega's troops were quickly neutralized. Then the operation shifted to mopping up pockets of resistance and restoring order in Panama City, which appeared to be on the verge of anarchy.
Move them people out over there.
Within days, the country was firmly in American hands. Though Noriega himself eluded capture for several days by seeking refuge in the Vatican embassy, his rule was at an end. From a military point of view, the operation was almost a complete success. Unlike Grenada, the diverse elements of the invasion force worked together flawlessly, like different parts of the same fighting machine. The final result was that the airmobile concept had once again proven its worth in modern combat. Today, it's almost impossible to think of any branch of our armed forces without thinking of the element of air mobility. What started out as a highly specialized technique of war has become commonplace. In the modern world, where the ability to react quickly and decisively to a highly fluid set of circumstances on a global scale is absolutely essential, everything has become airborne.